Orchestral musicians tune instruments as the concert master prepares for the performance. The conductor raises his baton, signaling the symphony to begin in the hushed hall. Audience members watch intently from the darkened rows of the opulent theater. A flutist concentrates on the score, his fingers dancing across the silver keys. Will Graham stares ahead, his eyes reflecting the tension of the unfolding musical drama. Candlelight flickers in the room, casting deep red shadows across Will's pensive features. A woman shares a glass of wine, smiling warmly at Will across the candlelit table. Conversations hum softly among the guests gathered for the intimate, dimly lit dinner party. Will stands at the head of the table, addressing his guests with focused intensity. He remains seated, his expression solemn as he listens to the quiet room. The host moves around the empty dining space, preparing for the upcoming private meeting. Hannibal Lecter speaks with calculated precision, his gaze fixed on the person sitting opposite. Will sits at the desk, his hands resting on the surface amidst scattered papers. Hannibal leans forward in his chair, maintaining an air of unsettling, composed authority. The psychiatrist continues his probing monologue, searching for cracks in his visitor's resolve. Will responds to the taunts, his voice steady despite the weight of the conversation. He articulates a warning, leaning into the light to emphasize his growing suspicion. Hannibal remains motionless, absorbing the confrontation with a faint, chilling smile. The killer watches Will, eyes tracking every micro-movement for signs of weakness. Will pushes back against the psychological pressure, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. He pauses, searching for the right words to dismantle the manipulator's twisted logic. Will sighs, leaning back and rubbing his face in a gesture of utter exhaustion. He stands abruptly, pacing the room while trying to contain his surging frustration. Will rests his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling in quiet contemplation. He turns and exits the office, leaving the dim room to plunge into darkness. Will Graham grips the cold telephone, his knuckles white with suppressed terror. He pivots sharply, turning his back on the oppressive weight of the silent house. The profiler paces the narrow hallway, his eyes scanning for shadows that shouldn't exist. A jagged mirror reflects a fractured world, stained by the dark remnants of violence. He pauses, hand pressed against his chin, wrestling with the phantom images in his mind. Across the carpet, a thick, visceral trail of blood marks a path of carnage. Will brings the receiver to his ear, his breathing ragged and shallow in the gloom. Reflected in shattered glass, he studies his own gaunt face for signs of fracturing sanity. Blue light flickers over the debris, casting long, distorted shapes across the claustrophobic room. He leans closer to the glass, searching for a pattern in the chaos of shards. The sharp edges of reality press against him as he processes the horrific scene. Will sits amidst a sprawling sea of case files, anchored by his desperate hunt. He shifts his weight on the floor, isolating a single, crucial photograph from the pile. Exhaustion pulls at his features, yet he forces his weary eyes to remain vigilant. The agent rubs his face, the blue hues of the room deepening his isolation. He frantically sifts through the evidence, searching for a clue he missed the first time. Disturbing images of flesh and binding emerge from the clinical files, haunting his tired mind. He gestures emphatically while speaking, the urgency of the investigation dictating his every movement. Will pauses, his expression hardening as a new, terrifying realization takes firm root. He traces a finger along the typed report, his focus razor-sharp despite the mounting fatigue. His eyes widen as the pieces of the macabre puzzle finally lock into place. Alone in the soft light of his living room, he reads, absorbed by dark secrets. He speaks quietly into the telephone, his tone urgent and measured in the night air. The profiler listens intently, his face illuminated by the pale, cold glow of the lamp. He watches as the expert addresses the crowded room, mapping the path of a monster. Will Graham stares at the monster behind the reinforced glass. The profiler studies the prisoner, searching for a trace of human empathy. He keeps his distance, shielding himself from the doctor's psychological intrusions. The investigator adjusts his posture, bracing for the inevitable mind games. Silence stretches between them, thick with the weight of unsaid truths. The psychiatrist smiles, his gaze predatory and sharp as a scalpel. Will turns away, methodically buttoning his jacket to escape the chill. He secures his collar, preparing himself for the grim hunt ahead. The prisoner grips the metal bars, observing his visitor with keen interest. The visitor sits, his shoulders hunched under the strain of exhaustion. The killer leans closer to the screen, his eyes bright with malice. The investigator listens, weighing every calculated word for hidden meaning. He remains motionless, trying to decipher the shifting shadows of his adversary. The prisoner speaks, his voice a smooth lure for a drowning man. The visitor nods slowly, absorbing the dark implications of the conversation. He processes the information, his face a mask of practiced detachment. The profiler searches for flaws, hoping to find a crack in the armor. The prisoner watches him retreat, a faint expression of amusement lingering. He paces the cell, waiting for the seeds of doubt to sprout. The visitor pauses, glancing back at the man who haunts his dreams. He exits the facility, stepping out into the harsh, blinding daylight. Back at home, the investigator answers the telephone with trembling hands. He stands in the dim light, surrounded by memories of his family. He reviews the evidence, scrutinizing every photograph for missed patterns. He reaches for the home movies, searching for a ghost in the grain. The profiler examines the blood-stained crime scene photographs for hidden patterns. He pores over the dark, distorted images, hunting for a killer's twisted signature. The imprisoned psychiatrist waits in the shadows, his expression devoid of any empathy. A heavy steel door groans open, signaling a shift in the investigation's focus. Law enforcement officers advance cautiously down the corridor toward the guarded secure unit. They inspect the sterile, cold environment where the mastermind keeps his grim secrets. Guards patrol the perimeter, weapons drawn as they monitor the high-security prison cells. The captive predator sits quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant, unseen visitor. He reaches out, fingers trembling slightly as he activates the communication console equipment. A frantic woman scans through shelves of books inside the quiet, dimly lit shop. She pauses, listening intently to the footsteps approaching from the shadows nearby her. Back in the cell, the prisoner speaks into the telephone with chilling precision. His voice remains smooth, weaving a trap for the man on the line. The profiler listens intently, analyzing the cadence of every calculated, manipulative word spoken. A tense silence hangs heavy in the air between the two desperate men. The mastermind offers a cryptic clue, testing the investigator's failing resolve today. He smiles faintly, knowing the hook is set deep within the profiler's mind. The conversation ends abruptly, leaving the investigator alone with his encroaching, dark thoughts. He shifts his attention to the artwork, seeking meaning in the grotesque imagery. Technical workers move through the lab, carefully logging evidence found at the scene. A technician enters the darkened room, his silhouette sharp against the glowing monitors. He begins his delicate work, unaware of the eyes observing his every move. The specialist handles the film reel with practiced, gloved hands inside the booth. Colleagues gather around the screen, their faces illuminated by the harsh blue light. They whisper urgently, debating the significance of the latest discovery in the file. Will Graham inspects the evidence file, searching for a pattern in the chaos. The tidal basin emerges from the morning haze, a quiet reminder of city vigilance. A janitor mops the prison corridor, oblivious to the predator watching from behind glass. Security monitors flicker with grainy, high-contrast footage of a sterile interrogation room. 3 screens display the cage from different angles, trapping the doctor in light. Will meets with his team, their faces illuminated by the harsh, clinical office glow. They study the document intently, seeking the invisible thread linking the recent victims. The agents confer over the file, their tension mounting with every passing second. Will steps away from the desk, his mind racing to visualize the killer's next move. His eyes lock onto the wall, lost in a dark, internal reconstruction of crime. The agent questions him, hoping to bridge the gap between genius and madness. Will finally responds, his voice heavy with the crushing weight of his unwanted gift. He searches for words, struggling to describe the visceral horror of the dragon's presence. The junior agent points at the evidence, demanding a definitive answer from his mentor. Will remain silent, his expression a mask of profound, weary understanding of the beast. Huge industrial presses churn out the latest edition, printing secrets for the public consumption. Bundles of newspapers fall into stacks, headlines blaring the news of the ongoing investigation. The Library of Congress looms like a silent monument, holding answers in its depths. A hand aggressively marks the page, tracing lines of dark, twisted theological inspiration. Will dials the telephone, his heart pounding against his ribs in the dead silence. He speaks into the receiver, feeding information into the void, hoping to draw him. Meanwhile, the killer listens from the darkness, his breath shallow and controlled with intent. Rabas stirs in her sleep, caught in a dream while danger lingers nearby. She bolts upright in bed, heart racing, sensing a shift in the air tonight. Panic sets in as the shadows of her room seem to stretch and breathe. Will Graham struggles to restrain his internal demons. The profiler's breathing quickens as he reclaims his composure. A sharp, sudden movement forces his eyes wide open. Jack Crawford barks an urgent command to the gathered team. The agent leans in, his expression hardening with grim resolve. A flicker of movement interrupts the tense, low-light atmosphere. The old, isolated house stands defiant against a burning sky. Will closes his eyes to visualize the killer's next move. He tilts his head, listening to the echoes of violence. Francis Dolarhyde reveals the intricate, swirling ink across his back. A weary official delivers a final, desperate report on progress. Flames snake across the asphalt in a trail of destruction. The task force convenes around a desk piled with files. Edward Norton stares ahead, his eyes reflecting a deep exhaustion. An investigator questions the path of the latest grisly crime. Will leans back, his jaw tight with suppressed, simmering anger. The meeting room grows stifling as tensions begin to boil. A colleague voices a dangerous suspicion about their prime suspect. The veteran detective nods, accepting the grim reality before them. A woman speaks, her tone vibrating with newfound, cold clarity. Counselors observe the proceedings, their faces masks of professional concern. A sudden aggressive gesture cuts through the heavy, stagnant air. The woman looks down, shielding her eyes from the truth. He speaks with a chilling, calm precision about the past. The investigator watches, waiting for the trap to finally spring. Will Graham reviews grainy home movies, searching for a pattern in the chaos. He watches the killer's innocent victims play, feeling the weight of impending violence. The footage shifts to a young child, highlighting the cyclical nature of trauma. Will studies the girl's movements, recognizing the vulnerability of his own family. Molly sits beside him, offering a fragile sense of comfort in the dark. Fragments of a murder scene flicker on the screen, distorted and horrifyingly intimate. He leans closer, his face hardening as he decodes the killer's sick game. He shares a silent realization with his wife, acknowledging the encroaching danger. Will whispers his findings, his voice tight with the strain of the investigation. Molly anchors him as they confront the nightmare lurking just beyond their walls. A photograph of an elderly woman lies on the desk, hinting at old secrets. Will collapses onto the bed, physically drained by the relentless mental pursuit. He wakes suddenly, haunted by the dragon that refuses to be ignored. The profiler paces the room, his shadow stretching against the peeling wallpaper. He confronts his own reflection, seeing a man pushed to the absolute edge. Will searches his hidden safe, retrieving the weapon that will end the hunt. He stands before the safe, his scarred back muscles tight with cold resolve. He prepares for the end game, knowing only one of them can survive. Will stares through the glass, his eyes reflecting the fire of his obsession. Francis Dolarhyde stands alone in the dark, his transformation nearing its violent completion. Francis grips his pistol, the cold steel grounding his fragmented, murderous psyche. He test-fires the weapon into the gloom, a desperate act of final preparation. Francis screams, the sound lost in the hollow space of his secret sanctuary. He raises the gun to his own jaw, contemplating a final, grand escape. Will drives through the night, racing toward the inevitable, bloody final confrontation. Will Graham approaches the dark house, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. He peers through the window, catching a glimpse of life inside the frame. The killer suddenly lunges, pressing a cloth to the woman's face to silence her. The victim struggles in the dark, but the attacker's grip remains firm and lethal. He forces her down, his movements calculated and devoid of any human empathy. The assailant looms over her, his shadow cast long against the dimly lit wall. The woman stares up, terror etched deep into her features as he leans closer. He watches her reaction, savoring the raw fear radiating from his helpless target. His eyes widen, reflecting the cold, detached hunger of the beast within him. The killer stares intensely, lost in the chaotic vision of his own transformation. Twisted desire flickers across his face as the lethal encounter continues to escalate. The man stops, glancing toward the shadows as if sensing an unseen threat approaching. He turns his head, scanning the room for the source of the sudden noise. The woman's expression shifts from pure horror to a silent, desperate prayer for rescue. Her eyes widen further as the monster moves to finalize his violent, planned act. He grins, the expression malicious and terrifying, knowing his dark work is nearly complete. Tears stream down her face while she realizes the grim fate awaiting her tonight. Flames erupt in the background, casting an infernal glow over the entire bloody scene. She screams, her voice swallowed by the roaring hunger of the encroaching wall fire. The attacker turns toward the blaze, his silhouette framed by the intense, growing heat. His face distorts, scarred skin rippling as the fire consumes his manufactured human mask. The predator stands amidst the ruin, watching as everything he touched burns to ash. Authorities arrive, sirens wailing against the backdrop of the inferno destroying the house. Will finds the survivor, guiding her away as the structure collapses into burning rubble. The investigator later sits in a stark cell, reviewing the case one last time.